Welcome to part two of our conservative book series. I'm your host, John Harris. We are going to talk today about the Anti-Federalist Papers. Now, admittedly, the Anti-Federalist Papers are not a book like the last book we did, which was Reflections on the Revolution in France by Edmund Burke. That was a book by an individual, and it's very easy to follow a book. This is a little more complicated. This is a series of essays, many of them showing up in newspapers, that were critical of the United States Constitution of 1787. The Federalists saw things that they thought would lead to potential tyranny, and they wrote about them. And many of their predictions, well, I'll let you be the judge, but they seem to have known something about where this was going to head. Now, the Federalists you might have heard of because the Federalist Papers are often used to interpret the United States Constitution as they should be. Conservatives, and not just conservatives, but people interested in understanding the federal Constitution, will go back into the Federalist Papers to try to decipher what the original intent is of that document. But it's important to realize the Federalists were responding to another group, the group that shot first, the group that had issues before were the Anti-Federalists. And one of the great contributions of the Anti-Federalists is demanding a Bill of Rights. You've probably heard the Bill of Rights quoted just as much as you have portions of the Constitution, if not more so. And the Bill of Rights is only in our Constitution really because of the pressure coming from Anti-Federalists. So they did make a positive contribution to what America is and what America became. They're also important to listen to because I frame them more as conservative critics. Not that many of the Federalists weren't also conservative and interested in conserving things that were true and beautiful and good and valuable, but the Anti-Federalists were suspicious of consolidated power. They thought the general government, and that's the term they used, would grow. The Supreme Court, the Congress, the presidency, all of these branches had too much power under the system that was proposed in 1787. And so one of their mechanisms for limiting that was the Bill of Rights. But even with that, many of them were still fairly suspicious and made predictions that honestly were pretty prescient. And I'll show you some of those. I think it's important in the 2020s to realize what these debates were back in the 1780s and 90s, because those debates honestly haven't left us. We are still debating some of the same things pertaining to state and local authority versus the general government and consolidated power. We, if anything, have seen the growth of the national or the general government over the last few centuries. And as we're getting ready to celebrate the 250th anniversary of the United States, I think it's good to reflect on these things. Who were the conservatives? Was Alexander Hamilton one of the conservatives? Actually, he's one of the ones I think probably was the least conservative, if we understand conservative to be the securing and preserving of the decentralized Anglo-Protestant tradition that we've inherited. But he was one of the big Federalists. Was James Madison, was he a conservative? I think in many ways, yes. Russell Kirk thought he was. In some ways, though, he was also a friend of consolidated power, as was in some ways George Washington, who was influenced by Alexander Hamilton. One of the interesting things about this is it's not purely conservative liberal, but I think you could include both Federalists and Anti-Federalists in the conservative tradition, both of these documents. But if I were to choose which one was more conservative, which one was interested in preserving those local, unique structures that were inherited from Great Britain, I would say it's the Anti-Federalists. And this cuts across many lines. This isn't just a North-South thing. This is something that people in the South, people in the North were on both sides of. And so this is at an early stage in the formation of the Federal Republic. It's a fascinating thing to hear them when they have no experience to draw on yet, except for the experience of being colonies and living under the Articles of Confederation and then studying the experiences of others in England and in Rome. It's interesting to hear them try to come up with ideas for what would be the best arrangement, which is what we still want today. We want the best arrangement, right, for our children. So it's with that in mind that I bring you the Anti-Federalist Papers. And most of this video is going to be available to patrons only. So I will remind you, if you want to see the full entire video, you're going to have to go to the info section and click on the link there. And you can either pay a very small fee to watch the whole thing, or you can become one of my monthly patrons, which I really appreciate. It helps me be able to do this kind of work, which I don't see being done in a lot of places. Uh, Much of this video also, though, is going to be free. So up until the point that we start talking about very specific differences between Federalists and Anti-Federalists, I am going for free to give you a background on the Federalists and Anti-Federalists. So let's start. Let's first talk about the Anti-Federalists. Let's talk about who they were. Here's a picture of some of the main Anti-Federalists. You have on the right side Elbridge Gerry. He wrote Federal Farmer. He's from Massachusetts. You have George Clinton, governor of New York. He wrote the Cato Papers, we think. Now, some of this, by the way, is a bit speculative. We're not exactly sure who wrote Federal Farmer. Probably Elbridge Gerry, but we're not exactly sure. George Clinton, we're pretty sure, was Cato. We have Patrick Henry. He's the most prominent in this picture because he was probably one of the most prominent Anti-Federalists. We have Melancton Smith from New York. He wrote the Brutus Papers. And then we have Samuel Bryan, who wrote the Sentinel Papers. Now, you notice all these names are not, except for Patrick Henry, are there's two of them, right? You have names of people like Federal Farmer, right? You have pseudonyms. You have names that are not the name of the person behind them. In fact, in some cases, we don't know who is behind them. And maybe part of that is because the Anti-Federalists were the losers, right? They didn't get everything they wanted. They got a Bill of Rights, but they still weren't able to stop the Constitution. And we know a lot more, I think, about the Federalists and who wrote them because after the Constitution was adopted, there was no reason, essentially, to remain anonymous. But this forced people to be anonymous, forced people to deal with arguments and not just personalities. So I'm going to give you a little more details about who each of these were, but there you can see pictures. The only one that is not a historic representation, and I'm just going to admit this off the top because I could not find a historic representation, is Mr. Bryan over here, the author of Sentinel. I used a little bit of an AI picture generator to try to get a description of him and construct what he might have looked like. So other than him, these are all representations historically of what these particular men look like. Now, we have to understand the context in which these men are writing. The context is there are problems under the Articles of Confederation. I think it's important for every American to read the Articles of Confederation. If you read the Declaration of Independence, if you read the Constitution of the United States, and perhaps you read other things, maybe you read the Olive Branch Petition, maybe you read the Virginia Declaration of Rights, maybe you read some of the state constitutions or charters. Those are all good things. The Mayflower Compact, for example. But many people do not read the Articles of Confederation. And the Articles of Confederation were intended to be perpetual. I don't know if you knew that, but they were intended to go on and on and on, that to be an arrangement that would continue into the future. But the Articles of Confederation had some problems. Here's what James Madison said in 1787. There was an inability to regulate interstate commerce. He says, quote, the practice of many states in restricting the commercial intercourse with other states, rather, and putting their productions and manufactures on the same footing with those of foreign nations, though not contrary to the federal articles, is certainly adverse to the spirit of the Union and tends to beget retaliating regulations, not less expensive and vexatious in themselves than they are destructive of the general harmony. So you have all these states, 13 of them, and they have their different rules for regulating trade, and this creates confusion. They're changing, they seek their own interest, and you can't have smooth trade, especially if you want to trade from somewhere like New York, say, with Georgia. You got to go through all these other states, perhaps, or go into the ocean. And so how are you going to have smoothness in trade? Another issue here, Alexander Hamilton points out in Federalist 15, there's an inability to pay debts and settle disputes. He says, do we owe debts to foreigners and to our own citizens contracted in a time of imminent peril for the preservation of our political existence? These remain without any proper or satisfactory provision for their discharge. We have neither troops nor treasury nor government. So he's saying we have these debts, and after a war with Great Britain, of course, there were a lot of debts, and we have no ability to pay these back. We owe them on the state level. Some states are paying, some states aren't. We There's one of the issues actually that they had a problem with is what you do with all the claims that, for example, merchants in Great Britain have on companies and individuals and municipalities in the United States. Every state has different rules and different, and it's just very hard to pay debts, to settle disputes, to even have a credit system going forward with other countries when there's these 13 different states. And I think it's important to realize that they were 13 different states. I mean, there were 13, they were named separately in the treaty that Great Britain struck with the United States. They thought of themselves very differently. And at that time, it was the United States are, not the United States is. They weren't one consolidated group. It was 13 separate groups with their own unique uh, royal charters, constitutions, and ways of doing things. The other issue was inability to solve bad credit and internal unrest. John Jay had written this to Thomas Jefferson in 1786. He said, "The inefficiency of our government becomes daily more and more apparent. Our treasury and our credit are in a sad situation. And it is probable that either the wisdom or the passions of the people will produce changes. A spirit of licentiousness has infected Massachusetts, which appears more formidable than some at first apprehended." So John Jay is writing to Thomas Jefferson, and he's talking about unrest in the state of Massachusetts. And there was unrest over things like the inability to make good on pensions that Revolutionary War soldiers had. There was problems over the fact that when the states did try to tax in some areas, they were opposed for trying to tax, and so the general government could not force a taxation. They didn't have officers to do that. They relied on the states taxing and then giving a contribution, as it were, to the general government. But that system wasn't working. And that was also kind of a bad look for foreign governments. Why would you invest in a country like this? There was an inability to intimidate foreign powers. John Adams wrote to John Jay in 1785, "It is the British fixed design to keep possession of the posts upon the frontier." So the British haven't even left the areas they were supposed to leave after the War for Independence because the Americans have no ability, there's no force, there's no intimidation to stop them. They were just going to keep occupying forts that they had occupied for quite some time. Now, in this situation, there were essentially three options, says the federal farmer, one of the anti-federalists. And it would have appeared, if you're watching, in something like this. This is the Country Journal of Poughkeepsie, New York, which is right across the river from where I live. In fact, today there is a Poughkeepsie Journal. It tends to be more of a liberal outlet. I don't know if it traces back to this time, but this was the Poughkeepsie Country Journal. And Federal Farmer, his essays appear, his responses to the Constitution appear in this particular outlet. And he says there's three options. The Articles of Confederation aren't working. That's something everyone can agree on. And he says you could do this. You could have an arrangement where there's distinct republics connected under a federal head. So Congress can tax, make treaties, and wage war. So there's very limited powers Congress has. There's another arrangement you could have. You could have a consolidation, really, of all the states into one entire government. So forget about the states, right? Maybe they'll just be districts that are governed from the center. I would argue that this is what we have been heading towards for centuries. This is really what we ended up getting, but it took a long time, right, to get there. And different people will calculate this differently. Some will blame the Constitution. Others will say, no, it wasn't the Constitution. It was the Progressive Era. Or others will say it was Abraham Lincoln. It was these different forces. It was LBJ, right? It was these different forces that created the situation that we're in now. But either way, we ended up getting that situation. The Constitution doesn't seem to be able to have prevented that, right? That's the other option here, consolidation. And then the third option is consolidate the states as to certain national objects and leave them severely distinct independent republics. So the general government's powers extend to exclusively to foreign concerns and to a few internal concerns. to the coin, so that's to minting money, to post offices, to weights and measures, a general plan for the militia, and to naturalization, right? This is a federal system, essentially, right? There are two levels of government. You have state governments and you have a national or a consolidated government. So these are the three options here, right? And that he sees, at least, right? And the first one is more or less kind of what you had under the Articles of Confederation, maybe a little stronger. Congress can tax, right? Um, the third one is perhaps even stronger, right? There's a greater consolidation. There's different shades of consolidation here. But there's it's still a federal republic. We're leaving the states alone, but we're gonna have post offices. We're gonna have coining. We're gonna have some certain things in common, right? It's a little more Alexander Hamilton, right? But I think what Hamilton really wanted, I think, was this third option, just a consolidation of the states into one entire government. And that's what we've been headed towards, but that's not how the Constitution was sold. And I would argue, that's not even what the Constitution itself reflects. The Constitution was sold as and seems to reflect a federal division of some kind, and that is the American spirit, right? But the Anti-Federalists, who are really the Federalists, saw a problem in how the Constitution would potentially be used. So let's talk a little bit about the Federalists first, okay? The Federalists wrote primarily under the name Publius. Publius, and this stands for Publius Valerius Publicola, a founder of the Roman Republic who overthrew the monarchy in 509 BC, but yet he had an act of dismantling his hilltop house to dispel accusations of seeking kingship, which symbolized republican virtue and resistance to tyranny. So the Federalists are being accused of bringing in a consolidation. It's a Caesarian type thing. This is power. This is control. This isn't good. And Publius, they're writing under that name to reinforce to people who would know something about Roman history, which they knew more of back then, at least educated people, that actually what they're trying to do is they want a republic. They don't want the monarchy. They want smaller, more local, and more. It's not what you think it is, right? And so they use this name on purpose. And there's three primary authors to the Publius Papers, the Federalist Papers. You have James Madison, Alexander Hamilton, and John Jay. And of course, Alexander Hamilton writes the most. He writes 51. James Madison writes 29, and John Jay only writes 5. And I think most of those are concerned with the judiciary. Now, James Madison he played a leading role. Many call him the father of the Constitution. And he helped introduce the Bill of Rights. Alexander Hamilton, from the first Secretary of the Treasury. But Alexander Hamilton, actually, funny enough, some people debate this even today, one of the non-Americans. Now, of course, he's an American. I mean, at that time, many people were from other places because you had people born in Britain and so forth. But he was actually from the island of, I think it's pronounced Navis, in the British West Indies. And he actually came from there to the United States. So he just an interesting tidbit there. But he was the first Secretary of the Treasury. He was a key advocate for a strong national government. Of course, James Madison being from Virginia, and John Jay also being a Virginian. He's the first Chief Justice of the United States. He contributed essays to the Federalist Papers, only though 5 of them, and mostly on foreign affairs and the judiciary. These are your 3 main Federalists who are making the argument against the Anti-Federalists for the Constitution. Now, in Federalist 23 and Federalist 31, Alexander Hamilton says some, I think, very clear things that if you wanted to boil it down, what was their plan? What were they trying to do? It gives you a sense of it. So there were powers on the individual that the Constitution would have that were not available to the general government under the Articles of Confederation. And along these lines, Alexander Hamilton says, we must abandon the vain project of legislating upon the states in their collective capacities. We must extend the laws of the federal government to the individual citizen of America. So it's looking at this unit of the individual instead of the state, right? The general government before is looking at the states and governing an arrangement that the states are party to. Alexander Hamilton is saying there's a mechanism here for the government to actually look upon the individual itself. Now, this does not mean necessarily, this is not the Rosetta Stone on interpreting the Constitution, because of course the Constitution itself is something that is ratified by guess who? Not individuals, it's the states. So the states are actually party to this new Constitution. But Alexander Hamilton seems to have maybe some other motives in mind here. And he sees a potential for consolidating more power and getting some power over the individuals. He says the Union ought to be invested with the full power to levy troops, to build and equip fleets, and to raise the revenues which will be required for the formation and support of an army and a navy. And we'll later on talk about how this was a problem for the Anti-Federalists. They were very afraid of standing armies. The other thing was the power to incur debt. So Alexander Hamilton talks about this, and this is a big thing for him. He wants a national bank. He says the power of creating new funds upon new objects of taxation by its own authority would enable the national government to borrow as far as its necessities might require. So now the government can go into debt. The government can borrow on credit. This is something that was not possible before. Now it is. And it will be able to pay our debts if we were able to borrow from other people, right? From other interests. And this is, you can probably see if you're a conservative and you're hearing what I'm saying, and you're saying those are in the Federalist Papers. Oh my goodness, that doesn't sound very conservative. Well, there's a lot of things that don't sound, looking back, maybe that conservative. But you have to realize the times in which these documents were written. They're responding to the problems we already discussed regarding the Articles of Confederation. It's not the bloated government that we have today. Imagine if you didn't see anything regarding, you had no knowledge of the bloated government we have today, and you are trying yourself to create an arrangement along with other Americans that will prevent that kind of bloated government, right? So Alexander Hamilton later on, and we'll see some of these quotes, is saying this isn't going to grow the government. It's not, you're not going to be taxed more because now we have a mechanism for taking taxes from the general government, where it's not going to do that. The things you're fearful of, it's not going to do that. All is well, right? So you can either take that on its face. You can, a lot of people have seen Hamilton to be a figure that was maybe lying and really wanted this strong central government. Two books off the top of my head on that. Brian McClanahan has one, How Alexander Hamilton Screwed Up America is the title of that book. There is another book by Tom Woods called Hamilton's Curse. And both of those scholars, they believe that Hamilton is, what the quotes I just read for you are really, that's what he wants. He wants this very big government. He likes debt, and he is bringing to us the world that we inhabit today. He's trying to bring that to us, but he knows he can't say everything that he's thinking. And he's got to assuage the fears of the Anti-Federalists. So this isn't a study on Alexander Hamilton, but Hamilton generally in more conservative and libertarian circles is kind of the bad guy in this whole story. And I would say this is also a personal thing for me. I see Patrick Henry as one of the good guys. I just happen to like Patrick Henry. In fact, I initially thought of doing a Patrick Henry side biography, but I would just recommend going and reading maybe a biography of Patrick Henry. There are several good ones out there. Here are the Anti-Federalists, okay? So here's a deeper dive into who they were. They wrote under a few different pseudonyms as well. So you have Sentinel, which is probably Samuel Bryan, the son of a Pennsylvania Supreme Court Justice George Bryan. And Bryan warned that the Constitution favored elites and lacked a Bill of Rights, and he influenced Pennsylvania's ratification debates. His writings helped secure the adoption of the Bill of Rights. Then you have Langton Smith, a delegate to the Continental Congress from New York, and possibly he may have written under the pen name Brutus. We're going to assume that's the case. It may have been Robert Yates. There's a few other people that are assumed or suspected of it, but Langton Smith seems to have the best arguments for his authorship, and his speeches at New York's 1788 convention nearly blocked ratification, strengthening the push for amendments. And then we have my favorite. We have Patrick Henry. Patrick Henry opposed the Constitution at Virginia's 1788 convention. He argued it created a tyrannical government without a Bill of Rights, and his advocacy for amendments and states' rights was pivotal in securing the Bill of Rights. And one side thing I want to say about Patrick Henry, he's the guy who said, "Give me liberty, give me death," very famously. Patrick Henry is probably the most brilliant orator the United States has ever known. If not, he's up there. He's one of the top. And he had so much respect in his state of Virginia. Any office he ran for, he's going to win. He served in many capacities in the state of Virginia. He was a very conservative man. He was very intensely dedicated to the liberties of the people of Virginia. And one of the interesting things about him is towards the end of his life, George Washington essentially calls him up and says, in his retirement, I need you. And one of the crises that they're facing are the Virginia and Kentucky resolutions. And actually, Patrick Henry lent his weight to the nationalists to some extent in that particular debate. But at his heart, he was someone who was a localist, a states' rights guy. He was, if anything, maybe, I don't think Jefferson liked him too much, but he was like more Jeffersonian than Jefferson. And he is probably one of the best people that you can study in American history if you want to find a role model. One of the things also about him, I'll say, is towards the end of his life, especially, he became very concerned with advancing Christianity. And he handed out gospel tracts to people, gospel pamphlets, and talked to people about the Lord quite a bit. So he's a Christian hero in addition to being one of America's big heroes. But this American, opposed the Constitution of 1787. Isn't that interesting? And then, of course, we have George Clinton, the governor of New York. He wrote under the name Cato and criticized the Constitution's executive power as aristocratic. He led the New York's Anti-Federalists to demand amendments, and his efforts at the 1788 convention secured conditional ratification, bolstering the case for a Bill of Rights. Elbridge Gerry was a delegate from Massachusetts who likely wrote the Federal Farmer Papers and argued that the Constitution would violate states' rights. And you have here two of the Roman figures, Lucius Junius Brutus, who overthrew Rome's last king to establish the Republic, and then Cato the Younger, who died rather than live under Caesar's rule. So both of them known to be in the Roman history as those who supported a republic over consolidated power, which is what the Anti-Federalists wanted to be known as. Now, were the Federalists actually nationalists? This gets very confusing. They probably should be called the Nationalists. Because they saw the United States more as a national arrangement, that it was one consolidated thing. There were differences between states, but it was one thing. It was a nation. It was a national entity. And the Anti-Federalists were actually more of the Federalists. They viewed it as there are more separations between these states. So James Madison says in Federalist 39, he says, the proposed constitution, therefore, is in strictness neither a national nor a federal constitution, but a composition of both. Well, that's interesting. In its foundation, it is federal, not national. In the sources from which the ordinary powers of the government are drawn, it is partially federal and partially national. Now, that's partially because he's talking about the Senate and he's talking about the House and how they were different. There were differences in how one became a senator and one became a member of the House. But he's saying that there's it is partially federal, partially national. In the operation of these powers, it is national, not federal. In the extent of them, again, it is federal, not national. And finally, in the authoritative mode of introducing amendments, it is neither wholly federal nor wholly national. So make heads or tails of that, right? I mean, this is James Madison, father of the Constitution, and he's saying, our Constitution, it's not really national, it's not really federal, it's kind of both. But he leans more, by even admitting this, he is leaning more national than the Anti-Federalists, who are purely federal. They wanted the government to do some very limited things, the general government, but they wanted the states to retain most of the powers. Now, there were some points of agreement between the Anti-Federalists and the Federalists. One of those points of agreement is in the picture here. It's George Washington. Both of them seem to everyone loved George Washington, right? And George Washington was a man of very high virtue, and this was something that both agreed on. In fact, this is something that Sentinel, which is probably Samuel Bryan, said in Sentinel 1. He said, a republican or free government can only exist where the body of the people are virtuous and where property is pretty equally divided. In such a government, the people are the sovereign, and their sense of opinion is the criterion of every public measure. For when this ceases to be the case, the nature of the government is shaped, and in an aristocracy, monarchy or despotism will rise on its ruin. So without virtue, he admits you're going to get aristocracy, monarchy, or despotism. We need virtuous men if we're going to keep a federal republic. Without that, we're not going to have a federal republic. That's one of the issues that we have today. And we have James Madison in Federalist 10. He says the need for a self-limiting government. He says in framing the government, which is to be administered by men over men, the great difficulty lies in this. You must first enable the government to control the governed, and in the next place, oblige it to control itself. These are two things, and there's more than this, but these are two main things that the Federalists and the Anti-Federalists would have agreed wholeheartedly on. We need public virtue. We need a self-limiting government. And we need George Washington. They both like George Washington. Now, one of the things that the Anti-Federalists felt that they were being forced into and they didn't like was adopting the Constitution too rashly. And this is warned about in John DeWitt 1, and we don't know who wrote the John DeWitt papers, and also in Brutus 2. In John DeWitt, it says, we are but yet in infancy, and we had better proceed slow than too fast. Has anyone ever told you that? Has anyone ever told you with a major decision, like maybe you're marrying someone or you're choosing a school to go to, you're choosing a career path, hey, you better take this slow. You don't make this rashly because this is going to affect the rest of your life, right? And that's just on a personal life. Well, what about the life of a nation? What about the life of 13 separate nations? What about the life of your family living in a governmental arrangement? What would you do in that case? Well, that's what John DeWitt is trying to get at. He's saying, I am as much a federal man as any person. In a federal union lies our political salvation, to preserve that union and to make it respectable to foreign optics. The national government ought to be armed with all necessary powers. But the subject I conceive of infinite delicacy and requires both ability and reflection. In discussing points of such moment, America has nothing to do with passions or hard words. Every citizen has an undoubted right to examine for himself. Neither ought he to be ill-treated and abused because he does not think at the same moment exactly as we do. So he's saying there's a room for diversity of opinions here. We don't want to make this decision too rashly. Yes, we might be in a situation that's not the best. And of course, a federal union is going to be our political salvation, but what does that union actually look like? Can we just pump the brakes? Melanchthon Smith, something similar. And he brings a biblical example. He says, when the prophet Elisha told Hazael, I know the evil that thou wilt do unto the children of Israel. Their strongholds wilt thou set on fire, and their young men wilt thou slay with the sword, and wilt dash their children and rip up their women with child. Hazael had no idea that he ever should be guilty of such horrid cruelty, and said to the prophet, is thy servant a dog, that he should do this great thing? And Elisha answered, the Lord hath showed me that thou shalt be king of Syria. The event proved that Hazael only wanted an opportunity to perpetrate these enormities without restraint, and he had a disposition to do them, though he himself knew it not. So what Melanchthon Smith is trying to say, using this vivid biblical imagery, is, look, someone can seem innocent on the surface. Something like the Constitution and the people forwarding this Constitution, they may seem innocent on the surface. They want the right things, or their motives may be pure. But if you give them these powers, maybe they'll turn into something different. Maybe they're not going to be what they're like now. And it will be to our perdition. It will be to our peril. Our children will suffer with the consequences of what we do today. And therefore, it is better to take this slow. And that was one of the things that the Anti-Federalists were very animated about, of we need to be very careful with where we tread because there's a capacity for disaster. Now, opinions ranged on the extent to which the Constitution would be a problem to ordered liberty, federalism, local arrangements, etc. But there were some. John DeWitt, the second paper against the Constitution of 1787, he paints a very dystopian future. And I want to read some of this to you. He talks about central taxation, a standing army, the suspension of habeas corpus, states, the state courts being inferior to the federal judiciary. He talks about no trial by jury and the elimination of state constitutional power and the loss of state sovereignty. I'll read some of this to you. Central taxation. He says, you must also determine that they shall have the exclusive power of imposts and the duties on imports and exports, the power of laying excises and other duties, and the additional power of laying internal taxes upon your lands, your goods, your chattels, as well as your persons, at their sovereign pleasure, that the produce of these several funds shall be appropriated to the use of the United States, and collected by their own officers, armed with a military force, if a civil aid should not prove sufficient. Now, to some of us, things like their own military officers, it doesn't seem like that big of a deal because we know the IRS. The IRS is actually weaponized, and of course they can have power and oversight over you if you don't pay your taxes and this kind of thing, right? Well, at this time, this would have been so foreign to the people he's writing to. They never would have known a situation where someone from the general government, someone from Washington, D.C., would be able to, with their own officers, come in and arrest you or have any kind of force over you to compel you to pay your taxes. This is not the world that they inhabit. But that's the world that's described here. And in that particular world, there's too much of the taxation going on. They can just do it at their sovereign pleasure. They just have to vote a bill in and you're taxed. And I don't know about you, but this is probably something that does hit close to home for many of you. Yeah, it does feel that way, doesn't it? I mean, do you feel overtaxed, right? That's really the question that he's trying to address here, is that's what will happen. He talks about a standing army in times of peace. This was one of the big issues that the Anti-Federalists had. They didn't want a standing army. And you think about some of the military actions that are more civil unrest situations arise. There was one recently in California. The National Guard is called up. At that time, they didn't have a National Guard. They would have really, there was a development that took place, but they would have had civilians that were trained in military exercises. I mean, they just had a war, so they weren't short on those kinds of people. And they would get together for threats, commonly shared threats, right? But the idea of a standing army, the idea that you'd have professional soldiers on the payroll and of the federal government would have them on their payroll, and they would do the bidding of the general government. The government could just call them up to go take care of business somewhere. That was something that frightened the Anti-Federalists. And it's something that now, being so downstream from this, we just live with that. Even the state militias, right? The National Guards are federalized with very little restrictions. There's a lot of ease in doing that. So, of course, that's one of the other issues that's brought up here. You have the state courts that will be inferior. And he says, you must also say that your present Supreme Judicial Court shall be an inferior court to a continental court, which is to be inferior to the Supreme Court of the United States. That from an undue bias which they are espoused to have, the citizens of their own states, they shall not be competent to determine title to your real estate. Disputes which may arise upon a protested bill of exchange, a simple note of hand, a book debt, wherein your citizens shall be unfortunately involved with the disputes of such or any other kind with citizens either of other states or foreign states. So he's saying if you have citizens of another state that have a claim on you, the dispute, you have one between yourselves, or another country, that now you're going to have a court system set up with the Supreme Court being the highest level that will be able to decide those cases. You can appeal to the Supreme Court. The state courts will not have supremacy. This was a different situation than when they were used to. They had only state courts. The state courts determined what would happen. If you had a problem with someone domiciled in Virginia, you'd have to go to Virginia to deal with that and appeal to the courts of Virginia, right? Even if you lived in Pennsylvania. So this was another thing that they're concerned about. No trial by jury and the elimination of state constitutional power. He says in all such cases, they shall have a right to carry their causes to the Supreme Court, whether for delay only or vexation, however distant from the place you live or inconsistent with your circumstance. So basically, you could have to go to a court that's hundreds of miles away from where you live. At that time, that was a big deal. Today, we have planes, we have modern transportation. Back then, terribly inconvenient and terribly expensive. That such appeals shall be extended to matters of fact previously to a capacity of giving a complete answer to these proceedings. You must determine that the Constitution of your Commonwealth, which is instructive, beautiful, and consistent in practice, which has been justly admired in Europe as a model of perfection, and which the present convention have affected to imitate, a constitution which is especially calculated for your territory. So right now, I think what he's doing is he's talking about I believe he's talking about the articles and how he's saying that like there's either that or he's talking about a state constitution. I believe it's actually it is the Constitution of Massachusetts because John DeWitt was written to the citizens of Massachusetts. So I'm pretty sure that's what he's talking about, not the articles. But anyway, he's saying you have already a document that is admired, and this is one of the things that the present Constitution they're even taking this into consideration. This Constitution of the state of Massachusetts, and that's not going to be the governing document though when you have a dispute with another state or another country. And then, of course, the loss of state sovereignty. John DeWitt says the skeleton of it may remain, but its vital principle shall be transferred to the new government. Nay, you must still go further and agree to invest the new Congress with powers which you have yet, through proper, to withhold from your own present government. So you're going to have powers that you in Massachusetts have not given to your government, the state government. So now I'm sure he's talking about the Constitution of Massachusetts. And you are now going to give those powers, though, to an even more distant force. So these are the arguments or the future that he paints, John DeWitt. He said, this is what it's going to look like when you live under this thing. And some of those things we take for granted, but that would be something that for someone in 1787, 1788, 1789, that would have resonated, even in a place like Massachusetts. Now, one of the issues, one of the assumptions, one of the working assumptions between Federalists and Anti-Federalists, and I think there were likely Federalists who came down differently and Anti-Federalists who came down differently on this, but you could see emerging a fault line. There was a fault line forming between how one viewed the United States. And this, of course, I think was most prominently displayed in the American Civil War, in the war between the states, when you definitely had a contention that believed that it was the United States are in the South, and then in the North, the United States is. It's either preserve the Union, it's a one solidary thing, or this is no, we the Confederacy is a federation of states, and we're all separate and distinct. And what you had in during the time that the Constitution was being debated is you had people more on the Federalist side of things who were arguing for consolidation. And you'd have people more on the Anti-Federalist side that were arguing for difference. So I'll give you some examples. John Jay says this in Federalist too, and I've quoted this before. With equal pleasure, I have as often taken notice that Providence has been pleased to give this one connected country to one united people. Okay, so one united people he's talking about here. A people descended from the same ancestors, speaking the same language, professing the same religion, attached to the same principles of government, very similar in their manners and customs, and who by their joint counsels, arms, and efforts, fighting side by side throughout a long bloody war, have nobly established their general liberty and independence. Well, you have Anti-Federalist John DeWitt here, who, again, that's a pseudonym. We don't know exactly who wrote this, but someone who's writing to Massachusetts. And John DeWitt says, from the first settlement of the country, the necessity of the civil associations founded upon equality, consent, and proportionate justice have ever been universally acknowledged. The means of education always attended to, and the fountains of science brought within the reach of poverty. Hitherto, we have commenced society and advanced in all respects, resembling a family, without partial affections or even a domestic bickering. So there is some unity here, but it's a family unity. We're not one people in a sense. We are, there's different. There's sons, there's daughters, there's aunts and uncles, and we have a connection to each other, but we do have differences. He follows it up in his second paper, John DeWitt 2, the difference of interest, different manners, and different local prejudices in the different parts of the United States, that to obtain that majority of 3/4 to any of the single alteration. Now, what he's talking about here is amending the Constitution. So he's saying, if you want to amend this Constitution, it's going to be hard because look at the differences between us. We have to find 3/4 of us who agree. He says, essentially, affecting this or any other state amounts to an absolute impossibility. Why is it impossible, John DeWitt? Because we're so different, he says. The conduct of the delegates in dissolving the convention plainly speaks this language and no other. So you have the Anti-Federalists saying, you know what, we got differences. That's what they're emphasizing. We've got differences. Massachusetts is not Virginia. Yeah, we're like a family. There's similarities, but there's differences. And John Jay emphasizing, look, we're actually one people. And I think that is a fault line that is still in our country. That is still a debate that's happening, whether or not we should be governed by one size fits all government emanating from Washington, D.C., over all the various municipalities and jurisdictions of this grand country, from Alaska to Hawaii to California to New York to Florida and everything in between, or whether we are in fact different and maybe different decisions should be made in different places. We still have issues that come up, and there's still friction on whether this is a national issue or whether this is a state issue. Back then, people would have thought of themselves, even their identity, as coming from the state that they lived in. That was their country. I mean, remember when Robert E. Lee even said he cannot raise his arm against his own country? Virginia was his country, right? And that's how people thought. Now, when you say my country, you think of the whole United States of America. Alaska's part of it, Hawaii's part of it. I don't mean to pick on them, except that they're just in distance, they're just farther away. So, but even there, even the people there and the cultures there, which are very different, they're part of this, right? But there was a time in this country's history when you could be talking about your country and you meant the state that you were from. You were a Virginian, you were a Carolinian, that kind of thing. So for the Federalists, the source of threat, much of the source of threat was local. Okay. Now the Federalists believe that there was foreign threats and we needed to consolidate to try to stave off foreign threats to be strong in the face of other countries. But they thought that the weakness in our national fabric would come from the fact that there's these states with very different interests and different localities and regions, and that these regions themselves would contribute to a weak national government. And so what we needed to do was consolidate them. So the Federalists very much suspected a threat in the local. Alexander Hamilton in Federalist 1 says, among the most formidable of the obstacles which the new Constitution will have to encounter may readily be distinguished the obvious interest of a certain class of men in every state to resist all changes which may hazard a diminution. Am I saying that? Yeah, diminution of the power, emolument, and consequence of the offices they hold under the state establishment. So what he's saying is that there's this hierarchy, there's this landed gentry, there's a class of people that are on the state level that are nobility, essentially. They have power. And he's saying those guys have ambition. They have perverted ambition. And the perverted ambition of another class of men who will either hope to aggrandize themselves by the confusions of their country or will flatter themselves with their fair prospects of elevation from the subdivision of the empire into several partial confederacies than from its union under one government. So Alexander Hamilton is saying, hey, one of the things that could happen here, one of the proposals is that we just have different confederacies. We split up, right? Well, if that happens and we're just regions, I mean, look, what's going to happen? These local leaders are going to be leading things, right? Now, what makes them think national leaders are going to be any better? Well, we'll see. Alexander Hamilton also says in Federalist 1, a dangerous ambition more often lurks behind the specious mask of zeal for the rights of the people than under the forbidding appearance of zeal for the firmness and efficiency of the government. Now, he may be talking about Patrick Henry there. Patrick Henry was very much about the rights of the people and very connected to the nobility of Virginia. I mean, he could have power if he wanted it, whenever he wanted it. And he had virtue. And Alexander Hamilton is looking at that and he's saying, well, that's more of a threat, because what happens is we're not going to get the firmness and efficiency of government with people like that around. James Madison, Federalist 10. Among the numerous advantages promised by a well-constructed union, none deserves to be more accurately developed than its tendency to break and control the violence of faction. So the violence of faction, of the small unit, of the regional, the local hero and his connection with the people in a local region, that is the threat to connecting with each other and forming a efficient government, which is what Alexander Hamilton wanted. It's the control of the violence of the faction. So the faction ends up being the problem here. And of course, the particular picture I have here is Shays' Rebellion. Shays' Rebellion shows, look, you can have factions. You can't have local leaders that have problems and cause issues on a local level. So, of course, let's give them the benefit of the doubt here. This kind of thing does happen. But I'll ask you a question. Where do you more often see the great threats to your freedom and liberty? Is it from your local government? Could be. Is it from the national government? The Anti-Federalists thought the source of the threat would be consolidation more than the local. So Patrick Henry says at the Virginia Ratification Convention, he stands up, and this is, of course, a picture of him in the, give me the liberty, give me liberty or give me death speech. So this is a younger Patrick Henry. But when it came to the Virginia Ratification Convention, he said, "We drew the spirit of liberty from our British ancestors. By that spirit, we have triumphed over every difficulty. But now, sir, the American spirit, assisted by the ropes and chains of consolidation, is about to convert this country into a powerful and mighty empire. If you make the citizens of this country agree to become the subjects of one great consolidated empire of America," notice he uses the word empire here, "your government will not have sufficient energy to keep them together. Such a government is incapable with the genius of republicanism. There will be no checks, no real balances in the government." So he's saying, you can say bye to your liberty. This is going to be an empire. You think you're getting a federal republic, you're going to get an empire if you go through with this. Now, of course, it's important to remember when I'm talking about this, we are talking about a constitution without a Bill of Rights at this point, okay? Of course, the Bill of Rights are added, and that addition assuages enough of the Anti-Federalists that they go along with it, right? But this is what Patrick Henry fears. Sentinel, which was written probably by Samuel Bryan, he says, "It is the opinion of the greatest writers that a very extensive country cannot be governed on democratical principles." So there's a scale issue here. You have such a big country. How are you going to have a democracy? How do you even, there's no mechanism for everyone to have their say. So you have a Republican form, but then the more people, and the more regional, distance, the less proximity there is from the representatives to the people they represent. And the more people they represent, which means less access to the person who represents you. You can't have a democratic system like this. Federal Farmer says one government and general legislation alone never can extend equal benefits to all parts of the United States. Different laws, customs, and opinions exist in the different states, which by a uniform system of laws would be unreasonably invaded. So he's saying we got to keep our local customs, our local differences. They're suited to our regions. We can't just let a one-size-fits-all government come in. That's going to be the threat to our liberties. Now, which has been more of a threat to liberties in the long run? Has it been the local? Has it been states? States can certainly do that. Local governments can certainly do that. But has it been the national government? Because when the national government makes a decision, it's for everyone, right? The general government is jurisdiction flows over the entire span of the United States of America. So this is one of the things the Federalists and Anti-Federalists, they're hashing this out back then. We're still hashing some of this out. Now, the Federalists needed to sell this to the states. They needed to convince states who are hearing these Anti-Federalist arguments that there's no merit to them, that these fears are overplayed. Don't worry about it, right? So John Jay says in Federalist 2, now he tries to talk about the fact that there's one people, and he uses this language to appeal to them, that an inheritance so proper and convenient for a band of brethren, united to each other by the strongest ties, should never be split into a number of unsocial, jealous, and alien sovereignties. So there's an emotional appeal here. Like, look what we went through together. We went through the Revolutionary War together. We've been through so much. Why don't we got to stay together? I mean, it echoes kind of, you could hear the preserve the Union language that came during the Civil War, right? We got to stick together, guys. Tradition, also another appeal they make. But politicians now appear, says John Jay, to insist that this opinion is erroneous, that instead of looking for safety and happiness in union, we ought to seek it in a division of the states into distinct confederacies or sovereignties. So, well, he's saying we've been together. We fought a war together. I mean, that's just the default, right? We've been together. And look, there's people out there who want separate united republics. They want separate confederacies. We shouldn't. And there were people saying things like this. Now, whether they were serious, I mean, this is what he's trying to say, though, that tradition is on our side, right? Now, whether it was or not, I mean, it's is tradition on their side when it comes to a stronger federal government? Perhaps not, but Tradition is on their side in that they've suffered through things together. They have shared experiences together, the various states. Now, popularity is another thing. Now, this is popular, guys. Get on the bandwagon. Federalist 3, John Jay says that consideration naturally tends to create great respect for the high opinion which the people of America have so long and uniformly entertained of the importance of their continuing firmly united under one federal government, vested with sufficient powers for all the general and national purposes. In other words, this is popular. People want this. The people of America, this is what they want, right? So anytime you think something's popular, you're more inclined to it, unless you're a hipster. And then if it's popular, you don't like it anymore, right? Talent is another thing. Look, John Jay says this, and this is, I told you earlier, I signaled this. I said, what are the leaders going to look like if they're not the local leaders that you're attached to? Well, this is what the leaders would look like, right? It will be the widest field of choice, says John Jay. So the people that you're going to have ruling you are going to be the best of the best. Why? Because it's not just the best in Virginia. It's not just the best in North Carolina or Delaware. You're going to have the whole span of the country to choose from, right? You're going to get the best people, right? Trump says he has the best people. You're going to have the best people from all these various places. And the theory back then was that in a virtuous republic, the most people with the most virtue would rise to the top. This was the natural aristocracy Thomas Jefferson talked about. The people with virtue are naturally going to be the leaders of the local area. And then when they have elections and competitions and, the best man wins, and eventually you get the best kind of leader. And George Washington, look, he's the best. So wouldn't that, in that time, it might seem like that, right? So I don't, now looking back at this over 250 years later, what do we actually think about this, right? What do we actually think? Or actually, I said over 250 years. It's not quite, because this was 1787. They were debating all this, but what kind of leaders populate our Senate? What kind of leaders populate the House of Representatives or the administration in presidencies? Are they the same quality as the leaders that you would get at a local or state level? That's a question I think worth asking. Oftentimes, it seems like you get worse people in the higher offices because of various things like their having a selfish ambition and ladder climbing and dirt on other people and being able to have money to buy the office. And all these other factors, right? And maybe that's because we don't have the same virtue anymore. But that was the theory that John Jay thought. We're going to get the best leaders. We're also going to have a limited central government, guys. It's not going to be like the Anti-Federalists tell you, okay? It's not going to be that consolidated. Federalist 23 says it's going to be for mutual benefit. The principal purposes to be answered by union are these: the common defense of the members, the preservation of the public peace, as well against internal convulsions or external attacks, the regulation of our commerce with other nations and between states, and the superintendence of our intercourse, political and commercial, with foreign countries. Alexander Hamilton says this. What's he saying? It's just trade. It's the stopping attacks that could come. That it's limited to those things. It's not. We're not going beyond that. We're going to regulate commerce. It's going to be better, more efficient. We're going to have a better military. But that's it, guys, right? So don't go thinking that we're going to have all the various federal bureaucracies we have today. We're not going to have an EPA. We're not going to have a Department of Education. We're not going to have all the various intelligence agencies and education agencies. And none of that would have, they would have been shocked. I think even Alexander Hamilton would probably be shocked at what we have today. Possibly. It's going to have states' rights, guys. We're not getting rid of that. James Madison, Federalist 45, the powers delegated by the proposed Constitution to the federal government are few and defined. Those which are to remain in the state governments are numerous and indefinite. So it's going to be a limited government. States are still going to have rights. Don't worry about it. Right? That's what they're trying to say, to sell it to the states. They're also saying it's for our safety. Federalist 3, among the many objects to which a wise and free people find it necessary to direct their attention, that of providing for their safety. Peace. We're going to have peace. An entire and perfect union will be the solid foundation of lasting peace. Federalist 5, peace from faction, right? If these states should be either wholly disunited or only united in partial confederacies, the subdivisions into which they might be thrown would have frequent and violent contests with each other. That's Federalist 6. So look, The theory here is like if we don't unite under one government, the states are just going to go to war. Like they're not going to like each other, right? This is an interesting thing because you can see in other places that, throughout Europe, for example, for centuries, you would have intermarriages among the elites to try to prevent war, right? If you're married to the Queen of France, maybe you're not going to go to war, right? That kind of thing. But there have been many times European powers come together to meet a threat. Think of the Cold War, right? Western Europe unites. Uh, there are situations where sovereign countries unite, actually quite often because of a threat that is uh, against all of them. So the theory here, though, is that if they don't unite under a central government, that Virginia and Pennsylvania, Maryland, they're not going to like each other too much, and there's going to be friction between them. Foreign nations was the other threat to peace. Whether the division of America into any given number of independent sovereignties would tend to secure us against the hostilities and improper interference of foreign nations. So, what if England has an alliance with Virginia and wants to invade Georgia? Right? Virginia is not helping Georgia in that circumstance, right? So, wouldn't it be better if we were all together? All right, and there's some logic to this. From becoming enemies, neighboring nations, says Federal 6, are naturally enemies of each other. I don't know that that's true. They're naturally enemies. In fact, are we naturally enemies of Canada? I don't know about that. There's some animosity there, but I think more often than not, we have to get along with the people that we're next to. And aren't you glad that we're not united with Canada? By the way, tidbit here: Canada, under the Articles of Confederation, could have become one of the states in the United States anytime they wanted to. I don't know if you knew that, but Canada was actually uh, potentially going to be a state in the United States at one time. Now, aren't you glad in a way that that didn't happen? Because look at Canada today. And if the people of it would just add to the dominance that the Northeast has. And that's why at the Hartford Convention, the Northeast thought about joining Canada, right? We have much in common with Canada. We could join them and get rid of all these Southerners, these agrarian people that have a different interest, these war hawks. We're a trade people, a seafaring people. We'll just join Canada. So that's a free one there. But Canada obviously has been somewhat of an ally of the United States. So I don't know that this is completely true, but that was the theory. And efficiency is the next thing, right? So safety, peace, efficiency. We're going to have a more efficient government if we consolidate. Federalist 4, how and when and in what proportion shall aids of men and money be afforded? Who shall command the allied armies, and from which of them shall receive his orders? Who shall settle the terms of peace? And it goes on and on with like all these questions about where's the chain of command, right? That's the central question this is getting at. How do you know whose orders to follow if you have the generals of all these different places, right? Wouldn't it be better if we had one military and it's more efficient, right? So that's the argument. Those are the arguments that they give to the states. Let's continue with specific provisions in the Constitution that the Federalists and Anti-Federalists argued over. So one is the preamble, which says, "We, the people of the United States, in order to form a more perfect union, establish justice, ensure domestic tranquility, provide for the common defense, and promote the general welfare, and secure the blessings of liberty to ourselves and our posterity, do ordain and establish this Constitution." Now, this gets quoted a lot today, especially the line about ourselves and our posterity. That didn't used to be the line that was most quoted, but now it is quoted because of immigration debates. But this is a section that a lot of people memorize when they're very young. I know I did. It's not technically law, though. It's the preamble. So it's telling you the purpose for the laws that are to come. And one anti-federalist, Millington Smith, most likely, in Brutus 11, saw a problem with this. He said expansive judicial interpretation would take place because of this. He says they will be authorized to give the Constitution a construction according to its spirit and reason and not to confine themselves to its letter. Now, was he right about this? Well, the preamble talks about the general welfare. And if you can promote the general welfare according to whatever standard you have, you can run roughshod over the rest of the document, right? But most people who have tried to do this over time, expand government, infringe on the states, infringe on individual rights, and those kinds of things, have done so not by using the preamble, because they don't really need to, but by using another portion of the Constitution where the term general welfare clause comes up. And we know that as the general welfare clause. And it's Article 1, Section 8. It says the Congress shall have power to lay and collect taxes, duties, imposts, and excises to pay the debts and provide for the common defense and general welfare of the United States. Now, it's hearkening back to the preamble. Samuel Bryan saw problems with this. Melancton Smith saw problems with this. Samuel Bryan said the Congress may construe every purpose for which the state legislatures now lay taxes to be for the general welfare. He's saying it's an like a open check. You could sign anything, right? This is just the sky's the limit when it comes to this. And Melancton Smith said something similar. He says it is absurd to say that the power of Congress is limited by these general expressions to provide for the common safety and general welfare, as it would be to say that it would be limited had the Constitution said that they should have power to lay taxes at will and pleasure. He's saying this is a positive thing. This isn't a negative gate that is erected to prevent Congress from doing something. This is something that is giving Congress a blank check. And the quote I had there is from John Rutledge from South Carolina, who became the governor of South Carolina. He was a delegate to the Constitutional Convention, and he said, the legislature of the U.S. shall have power to fulfill the engagements which have been entered into by Congress and to discharge as well the debts of the U.S. as the debts incurred by the several states during the late war for the common defense and general welfare. What he's talking about there is this doctrine of assumption that these states all in an expensive war took out loans. And those loans need to be paid back, and they're not all paid back. Now, the Anti-Federalist retort to this and concern was generally that, look, every state's different. Why should Massachusetts have to pay for what Georgia did? Why should Georgia have to pay for what Maryland did? Why? We all have our debts we took out. It's not fair if responsible states are left to pay for what irresponsible states did. It's just each state should take care of themselves. Well, assumption is this idea that actually, in the interest of getting credit and being attractive to outside investors and paying these debts off, and coupled with the national bank, which we'll talk about in a moment, where the national bank can actually take out its own debt, the national or the general government is now going to assume all these debts and pay them back itself. And that will get us out of this pickle that we're in, all of us. Well, this logic was based upon general welfare, right? And this general welfare clause has been used throughout, especially the 20th century, to justify all kinds of expansions of government. The Social Security Act was justified based on the general welfare. Even Obamacare itself was justified based on general welfare. It's the power to tax under general welfare. So Congress can do this. Congress can have Obamacare. So this has been used as a wax nose for a long time. And the Anti-Federalists saw this kind of thing happening. Another one is the necessary and proper clause, or the elastic clause. The Anti-Federalists saw a problem with this. It says in Article 1, Section 8, Congress shall have power to make all laws which shall be necessary and proper for carrying into execution the foregoing powers and all other powers vested by this Constitution in the government of the United States. Well, Federal Farmer saw this and said the powers given the legislature under the 8th section of the first article had no other limitation than the discretion of the Congress. It was shown that even if the most favorable construction was given to this paragraph, that the advocates for the new Constitution could wish it will convey power to lay and collect taxes, impose duties, and excises according to the discretion of the legislature, and to make all laws which they shall judge proper and necessary to carry this power into execution. Again, he's saying, I spy another wax nose here. I spy another blank check here. Alexander Hamilton used this to support the idea of a national bank. He said, if the end be clearly comprehended within any of the specified powers, and if the measure have an obvious relation to that end, and it is not forbidden by any particular provision of the Constitution, it may safely be deemed to come within the compass of the national authority. Now, the national bank was quite a big controversy. In fact, Andrew Jackson later famously ended the national bank, right? Thomas Jefferson against the national bank. Hamilton very for the national bank. This was a huge clash. And the national bank was justified on this premise. In fact, it was upheld in court. In the specific court case was McAuliffe versus Maryland, very famous Supreme Court case in 1819. And Justice John Marshall says, look, it's constitutional to have a national bank because of the necessary and proper clause. How can Congress execute its enumerated powers, such as taxing, borrowing, and regulating commerce, if they don't have a bank? And now, of course, they did that before the national bank. But this was something that the Anti-Federalists feared. and the Federalists loved. At least Alexander Hamilton sure did. Then the Supremacy Clause, right? The Constitution and the laws of the United States, which shall be made in pursuance thereof, and all the treaties made, or which shall be made under the authority of the United States, shall be the supreme law of the land, and the judges in every state shall be bound thereby, anything in the Constitution or laws of any state to the contrary, notwithstanding. That's Article 6. Well, Brutus, Langton Smith, writing under the name Brutus, most likely, says Congress has authority to make laws which will affect the lives and liberty and property of every man in the United States. Nor can the Constitution or the laws of any state in any way prevent or impede the full and complete execution of every power given. The legislature have authority to contract debts at their discretion. They are the sole judges of what is necessary to provide for the common defense, and they only are to determine what is for the general welfare. Now, the quote I have on the side from Joseph Story is from a case called Martin versus Hunter's Lessee. And in that particular case, it arose when Virginia courts denied a federal treaty's protection of land titles, and the Supreme Court ruled that the Supremacy Clause made federal law, including treaties, superior to conflicting state laws, thus justifying federal appellate jurisdiction. This decision expanded federal power by ensuring that the state courts could not undermine federal law. And what he says here in his decision is that the Constitution and the laws of the United States, which shall be made in pursuance thereof, and all treaties made, or which shall be made under the authority of the United States, shall be the supreme law of the land, and the judges in every state shall be bound thereby, anything in the Constitution or laws of any state to the contrary, notwithstanding. Now, this particular clause has been used in a lot of the civil rights cases, civil rights acts, and most recently, I think one of the last things that this was used on was Arizona. Maybe this was 2 decades ago, wanting to enforce federal law, federal immigration law that was not being enforced. And they were told they couldn't, and it was because of this particular clause. So this particular clause, I don't know if we have a scoreboard here, but the Anti-Federalists were probably right in their suspicions about what would happen given this. And of course, there's also disagreements over standing armies. And there's a lot that could be said about this. The Federalists talk about it quite a bit. They say, look, we need an army. It's necessary for defense. Alexander Hamilton in Federalist 24. In Federalist 29, Alexander Hamilton says it's going to be more efficient. Federalist 27, Alexander Hamilton says, look, states are just as capable of tyranny, so don't worry about a federal army, a federal force that can be called to action. We're going to need some of this. And of course, the picture here that I have displayed for you is a comic from the Reconstruction era during the Civil War. And it's showing federal troops essentially forcing the South to accept a carpetbag rule. So by military power at gunpoint, they are forced, they're treated like occupied territory, even though the theory that Lincoln had was that the states had never really left the Union. They were always part of the Union, right? But then they're treated like an occupied foreign country. And this is the problem when you have standing armies, right? Standing armies lead to tyranny and all kinds of conditions that in the Reconstruction South were negative. And standing armies are part of the problem here, right? So this is one of the things that the Anti-Federalists are concerned about. Brutus, probably written by Langton Smith, Brutus says in number 10, the liberties of a people are in danger from a large standing army, not only because of the rulers who may employ them for the purposes of supporting themselves in any usurpations of power, which they may see proper to exercise, but there is great hazard that an army will subvert the forms of government under whose authority they are raised and establish one according to the pleasure of their leader. So once you have force, you have the law at your display. The law can't stop you. The letter of the law has no authority over you if there's nothing powerful enough to stop you. If you hold the keys to the army, then essentially you win, right? And that's what they're afraid of. And this is, again, in a time when things are very decentralized. You have essentially voluntary militia type armies for the most part that would have served as similar to our National Guard today. And so they're very suspicious of militarization because of the conditions that they came from, too. They didn't like the Quartering Act. They didn't like what the British did to them in the War for Independence. If you don't understand that background, these kinds of debates aren't all going to make sense. There's a disagreement about scale. One government and the general legislation alone never can extend equal benefits to all parts of the United States, says Federal Farmer in number 1. Different laws, customs, and opinions exist in the different states. So if you have one government, a one-size-fits-all government, it's going to be a problem. Federal Farmer says one Supreme Court could not preserve trial by jury. How is that going to happen? You can't. What are you going to pick, a jury from all the states? I mean, and of course, the Supreme Court doesn't use a jury, right? Federal Farmer on rural subservience. The extreme outlying states and their principal towns become much less important under this. So the cities are going to become the urban centers. Of course, we can see that happens. Cato 5 about representation says the number of senators and representatives proposed for this vast continent does not equal those of your own state. How great the disparity. So there's this principle that as things grow and you have more and more people represented by the same representatives, the farther and farther away those representatives get from the interests of the people, and the less they are going to be held accountable for doing the people's bidding. And I think that's true. And in fact, if you look at the number of representatives today versus the numbers of representatives that that represented fewer people back in 1789, it is quite different. It is quite different. In fact, today, with 434 representatives and a population of about 335.9 million, each member of Congress represents roughly 760,000 people. This is a significant increase, right? Because in 1789, each U.S. House member represented about 33,000 to 61,000 people or so. So it's, the scale is just off. Anyway, there were also disagreements about judicial review. Federalist 78, Alexander Hamilton talks about this. Federalist 81, Alexander Hamilton talks about it. He also talks about it in Federalist 80. And in each case, he talks about judicial review. I'll read one of them, Federalist 78. The interpretation of the laws is the proper and peculiar province of the courts. A constitution is, in fact, and must be regarded by the judges as a fundamental law. It therefore belongs to them to ascertain its meaning as well as the meaning of any particular act proceeding from the legislative body. Now, this is very different than what they're used to even in Great Britain, where the legislature has more of an authority in interpretation of laws. But you see in the Virginia and Kentucky resolutions written by, ironically, Thomas Jefferson and James Madison, that they believe states actually could also interpret laws. If they felt something was unconstitutional, they thought that it was unconstitutional. They did not have to abide by it. They did not have to live under a tyranny if the state didn't want to. And this, of course, has been a problem even to this day. Do states have the ability to just say no to the national or central government when they think something's unconstitutional and they're not bound by it? Some of the recent cases are things like laws concerning marijuana and drugs and so forth. And, the federal laws say this, but what about our states? Can our states override those kinds of things, right? This has been an issue for a long time. And the Anti-Federalists were very worried that we would get judicial supremacy. In Article 3, Section 2 of the Constitution, it says the judicial power shall extend to all cases in law and equity arising under this Constitution. And so in all cases of law and equity, they thought, well, that's not good. They had a lot of fears. Brutus, the growth of the centralized legislative power. He says, it is easy to see that in their if I can say the word, adjudications, they may establish certain principles which, being received by the legislature, will enlarge the sphere of their power beyond all bounds. Brutus 15 talks about the growth of judicial oversight. The judges under this Constitution will control the legislature, for the Supreme Court are authorized in the last resort to determine what is the extent of the powers of Congress. They are to give the Constitution an expression, or explanation rather, and there is no power above them to set aside their judgment. So he's saying, look, you're going to get judicial review. The erosion of state power is going to happen in Brutus 11. It is easy to see, based on the concurrent jurisdiction, that in proportion as the general government acquires power and jurisdiction by the liberal construction which the judges may give the Constitution, will those of the states lose its rights until they become so trifling and unimportant as to not be worth having. That is amazing. That the states are going to be so trifling, they're not even worth having anymore. Why even have a state if the Supreme Court's just going to determine when there's a dispute between the states and the central government, the general government? the Supreme Court's the one that's going to determine all this. And who do they work for? Well, the general government. So the state, where does it leave the states? That's his argument, essentially. Where does that leave the states? The states have no recourse in this. And of course, I have a picture there of the Warren Court, which, if you want to think about judicial supremacy, the Warren Court is probably one of the courts that would be the most supremacist in the judiciary, the most innovative. I mean, we're taking prayer out of schools and all the other things. Judicial accountability was another thing they were concerned about. Article 3, Section 2 says judges, both of the Supreme and inferior courts, shall hold their office during good behavior. So they're not elected, they just hold their office. And Brutus said they are to be rendered totally independent, both of the people and the legislature, both with respect to their offices and salaries. No errors they may commit can be corrected by any power above them, if any such power there be, nor can they be removed from office for making ever so erroneous adjudications. Here's what he's saying. Once judges get something wrong, they're not going to be impeached. Do you really think they're going to be impeached? Now, I'll ask you, when can you last think of a Supreme Court justice being impeached by Congress? Does it ever happen? And I know it's something my dad has always complained about, especially during the Obama years, is like, why aren't these judges being impeached? We have Republican control in Congress. Why aren't they being impeached? Well, if you would have read the Anti-Federalist Papers, if you would have read what Brutus was saying, it would have, he said, it's in the structure of the Constitution. There's no way they're going to be able to do it. States' rights is another thing. You have the Federalist 84. States neither lose any of their rights nor are discharged from any of their obligations by a change in the form of their civil government. But Melanchthon Smith says, it is difficult to conceive how the state legislatures can, in any case, hold a check over the general legislature in a constitutional way. The latter has, in every instance to which their powers extends, complete control over the former. And of course, the picture there is of a pamphlet that contains the Virginia and Kentucky resolutions. This became an issue all throughout, especially before the Civil War, but it's continued after the Civil War. This is still an issue, right? Where's the jurisdiction of the states and where's the jurisdiction of the general government? And COVID, this came out again. Can the general government tell the states what to do on this? Or can the states, can Ron DeSantis have a different policy in Florida? Is he allowed to do that? Is he allowed to say no to a law that he thinks is unconstitutional? Of course, the Virginia and Kentucky resolutions were a big part of this, but so was the force bill and the situation in South Carolina during the Tariff of Abominations, and there was issue, obviously, the Civil War itself. And then since then, there's been just a series of these kinds of things and erosion of the state's authority over the 20th century. The Senate and the House, there were concerns the Anti-Federalists had. Melanchthon Smith, probably writing for Brutus and Brutus 16, 6 years is a long period for a man to be absent from his home. It would have a tendency to wean him from his constituents. Yeah, you think 6 years as a senator is going to make one more loyal to their constituents? No, he's saying 6 years, they're gone. They might be representing Idaho, but they're in D.C. And who are they going to be loyal to? George Clinton in Cato 5. That the Senate and the president are further improperly connected will appear if it is considered that their dependence on each other, because the Senate approves treaties and appointments of the presidents, and the president can make them come in and work at inconvenient times and locations, extraordinary occasions. This will prevent either of them from being a check on one another. Now, I don't know if George Clinton's right about this. They have been somewhat of a check on one another, but they can be in cahoots. And that's what he's saying. John DeWitt says in John DeWitt 3, the members of the House, not with propriety, may they not with propriety be termed an assistant aristocratical branch, who will be infinitely more inclined to cooperate and compromise with each other than to be the careful guardians of the rights of their constituents. So he's saying, look, even in the House of Representatives, you're setting up an aristocratical branch. These are the aristocrats that are going to be coming, and they're going to be rubbing shoulders with each other, and they're going to have an allegiance to each other and not to the people that they're supposed to be representing. Now, is there a remedy for this is the question. I mean, you could adjust term limits. You can make it easier for states to recall their senators and things like this. But any body of people that have a shared interest are going to develop an in-group preference for one another, right? And that's what they're getting at here. Now, there's a movement today called the Convention of the States. I've heard a lot about this. Of like, we could just get the states get together. We could amend the Constitution. Now, I'm not sure if I want to see that happen because I don't know what they would do. But this has been something that I've had guys who are very big on this reach out to me, want me to be involved in it. But the idea of amending the Constitution was also a point of disagreement. The Federalists thought, look, it should be difficult. Uh, Jefferson had an idea of a 2/3 vote of two of the three branches for amendments in the Constitution, for amendment proposal to go through. And you see in Federalist 49 that this is shot down, that this would carry an implication of some defect in the government. Frequent appeals would be made. It would just be a mess. You would just, look, you're just going to keep amending this thing. We're not going to have a firm, stable government, right? But the Anti-Federalists said, actually, it should not be difficult. So the Federalists are saying it should be difficult to amend the Constitution. The Anti-Federalists said, no, it should not be difficult. Where is the probability that 3/4 of the states in this convention, or 3/4 of the legislatures of the different states whose interests differ scarcely in nothing short of everything, will be so very ready or willing materially to change any part of this system, which shall be the emolument of an individual state only? So he's saying, look, if it's so hard to amend this, you're never going to get changes. Like, we're going to have what we have. And for the most part, that's been true. Now, there have been amendments, but it's rare that you see a constitutional amendment. It's just a rare thing. And the Anti-Federalists believe that this should be accomplished by a majority, many of them. They had different schemes for it, but look, with a majority vote, we should be able to amend this because it's making most of the people upset. So it's not serving the best interests of the majority of the people. That's when we should be able to amend this. Now, I think there's good points made on both sides of this, but it is interesting that there have not been many amendments, and not many significant amendments, since the adoption of the Bill of Rights. You had, the post-Reconstruction amendments also were without the South voting on them. So much easier to get those through. If you even consider those valid, which some people actually don't, because they say, well, the South was always part of the Union and they didn't vote on it, then it didn't meet the threshold. But there's just been very few times that this has actually happened. Now, the Anti-Federalists were able to contribute the Bill of Rights. That's probably their greatest contribution. And John DeWitt says, look, those powers which the people of their constitutions, by their constitutions, expressly give them, they enjoy by positive grant, and those remaining ones, which they never meant to give them, and which the constitutions say nothing about, they enjoy by tacit implication, so that by one means and by the other they become possessed of the whole. This doctrine is but poorly calculated for the meridian of American, where the nature of compact, the mode of construing them, and the principles upon which society is founded are so accurately known and universally diffused. What he's saying is, look, in our state constitutions, we have to have a Bill of Rights to prevent our state governments from overstepping their boundaries. Because if you just give them positive things that they're supposed to do, you give them an inch, they'll take a mile. So you need limits, you need gates. And that's one of the things that the Anti-Federalists were able to contribute to the Constitution itself. And of course, here are the Bill of Rights. This is the first Article 1 through 10 right here that they were able to get through. And of course, we quote these all the time, right? This is where you talk about the right to bear arms and freedom of religion, and freedom from search and seizure. And if the 10th Amendment, my favorite, probably, the powers not delegated to the United States by the Constitution nor prohibited to the states are reserved to the states respectively, or to the people, right? They got this passed, and this has been, I think, to their credit, a needle in the side of the growth of government. Now, it's also been used, especially because of the incorporation doctrine, which we're not going to talk about really today, but this idea from the 14th Amendment that it's been used to incorporate the Bill of Rights into the Constitution, as if the Bill of Rights themselves now the federal government must use them to apply them to the states. So they're applied to the states now, is what I was trying to say. Those under that, we found weird stuff like rights to privacy, right, to support abortion and the rest. So it's not like this is going to stop everything, and it could be used inappropriately, but it's also been used to prevent the growth of government and infringing on rights. Now, here are the Federalist predictions. Here's what you've all been waiting for. The Federalists thought that we would have a wiser government, right? The administration, the political councils, the judicial decisions of the national government will be more wise, systematical, and judicious than those of the individual states. John Jay said this in Federalist 3. He says, look, there's going to be a broad field of talent. So, of course, it'll be better. Now, I'll let you decide for yourself. Do you think that the national government is wiser than state governments? There'll be less violence, John Jay says. Violences are often more frequently caused by the passions and interests of a part than of the whole. So he gives an example. He says, not a single Indian war has yet been occasioned by aggressions of the present federal government, feeble as it is. Now, here's the funny thing. You look back and you look at the 19th century and you think, well, who waged most of the wars on the Western tribes? I mean, since Jackson forward, Trails of Tear forward to Little Bighorn and all the rest, who's been the main instigator in Indian wars? Even during the Civil War, a lot of the tribes in Oklahoma and even in the South, like the Cherokee and stuff, they sided with the Confederacy. So who's been fighting the quote unquote Indians? Well, it's been the federal government. So, talk about a faceplant, I suppose. He's saying, look, it's the states that have caused the problem. Right, because at that point, the Articles of Confederation didn't give the federal government much power. So it's untested, right? But he's saying there'll be less violence. There's been more violence, I think. We should say that's been committed by the national government as opposed to the states. Public attachment to the general government. Alexander Hamilton says the more the operations of the national authority are intermingled in the ordinary exercise of government, the greater will be the probability that it will conciliate and the respect and attachments of the community. In other words, the people of the country will be more attached to the federal government or than the national government if we have a stronger national government, if we get the Constitution through. He's probably right about that. Federalist 78, Alexander Hamilton talks about a non-threatening judiciary. The judiciary, from the nature of its functions, will always be the least dangerous to the political rights of the Constitution. Now, do you think that the judiciary has been the least, I would say they've been the most of an enemy to the rights under the Constitution? The judiciary has been the worst of the three branches on this case, but Alexander Hamilton says, no, the judiciary will be the least. The states as a military check. In Federalist 28, Alexander Hamilton says, it may safely be received as an axiom in our political system that the state governments will, in all possible contingencies, afford complete security against invasions of the public liberty by the national authority. Now, in the American Civil War, was this the case? Were state governments able to coalesce to stop what they saw as tyranny coming from the center? I'll let you answer that yourself. You have no increase in public expense. And I'll go back to the state as a military check real quick. At the very least, even if you don't agree with that particular scenario I brought up, Alexander Hamilton is saying, hey, the states are going to be strong enough to stop this kind of stuff, right? State governments are strong, so they can stop invasions. Well, can they? Right? I mean, if that was the case, why do you even need a standing army or anything like that, right? No increase in public expense. Federalist 84 says, as to the persons to be employed in the collection of the revenues, it is unquestionably true that these will form a very considerable addition to the number of federal officers. Now, today we think of this as the IRS. It says, but it will not follow that this will occasion an increase of public expenses. So what he's trying to say is your taxes aren't going to go up because we have officers that are going to collect them. I'll let you be the judge. Have taxes gone up, right? These are the things that the Federalists predicted. Some of the things. There's more, but those are some of the things. Now, the Anti-Federalists, they had their own predictions. They said that there would be an erosion of state differences. Patrick Henry, the transition from a general unqualified admission to offices to a consolidation of government seems easy. For though the American states are dissimilar in their structure, this will assimilate them. So the states are going to be assimilated to each other. There's going to be a permanent aristocracy, says Samuel Bryan in Sentinel. It appears that it is devoid of all responsibility or accountability to the great body of the people, and that so far from being regular balanced government, it would be in practice a permanent aristocracy. Well, do you think the senators and congressmen in Washington, especially the ones that are there for a lifetime, do you think that they make up their own aristocracy? I would say yes. The general government will overtake state responsibilities, says Melancton Smith in Brutus 1. When the federal government begins to exercise the right of taxation in all its parts, the legislatures of the several states will find it impossible to raise monies to support their own governments. Without money, they cannot be supported, and they must dwindle away, and as before, observe their powers absorbed by that of the general government. So we see this all the time. We see this in things like education and welfare, where the center makes the decisions and funds most of the things, right? yeah, you pay some to your state, but there's a cooperation there. And without money and grants and things coming from the center, oftentimes the states can't fulfill their own obligations they have to their citizens. You have the growth of the general government. So, I mean, this is an obvious one. Every man and every body of men invested with power are ever disposed to increase it and to acquire a superiority over everything that stands in their way. This disposition, which is implanted in the human nature, will operate in the federal legislature to lessen and ultimately subvert the state authority. This is where the Anti-Federalists, I think, were right more than anything else. They could see the nature of man. They could see what man does. They could see what people do when they're given this much power. Generally, it doesn't mean there's not men with virtue who are able to wield it, but generally speaking, people aren't able to, and they will find the loophole. They'll try to find the justification to use more power and have more control over your lives. The central government will expand the demands of an expanding and diverse needs. So Brutus 6, Langton Smith says, to all these different classes of people and all these circumstances in which it will attend them, the language in which it will address them will be give. In other words, people are going to want more services. They're going to demand more, and the federal government's going to produce it. And then there's going to be unaccountable judiciary. There's going to be a general usurpation, says Brutus 11. The judicial power will operate to effect in most cases, in the most certain, but yet silent and imperceptible manner, what is evidently the tendency of the Constitution. I mean, an entire subversion of the legislative, executive, and judicial powers of the individual states. What he's saying is this will happen gradually. The courts will gradually get more and more and more power until they can tell your community that you can't erect a Christmas tree in that community, or you must have the Satan statue in your community, or you can't say the prayer in your public school in your community, or A, B, and C. There's a bird there that might be endangered. You can't develop on that land. You can. This is what the courts have done, right? Through bureaucracies and all the rest, the courts have enabled this. You have an unaccountable judiciary. Brutus 15 says they are independent of the people, of the legislative, and of every power under heaven. And listen to this. Men placed in this situation will generally soon feel themselves independent of heaven itself. So these judges are going to be independent of God. They're going to think they're God. That's what he's saying. They can just decide things like, oh, I don't know what a marriage is, right? I mean, who would have thought, or what kind of classes of people can just be murdered away? Crazy that the Anti-Federalists could see this kind of thing happening, but they could. And it foreshadows some of what happened in the Civil War. Federalists too. The prosperity of America depended on its union. To preserve and perpetuate it was the great object of the people in forming that convention, and is also the great object of the plan which the convention has advised them to adopt. Now, there's not a lot of language in the Federalist that I can like. I don't think it's Lincolnian, but there's clips like this where you're like, wow, that sounds like Abraham Lincoln, right? Preserve the union. That's the great, the union was preceded the states, right? And that's how far he went. You have Alexander Hamilton in Federalist 28. If the federal army should be able to quell the resistance of one state, the distant states would have it in their power to make head with the fresh forces. So yeah, okay, the states would be able to stop the federal army, right? We're not going to have a federal army big enough that the states couldn't among themselves stop it. Well, what happened in the Civil War? And they weren't able to stop it. John DeWitt says it is not so capable of alterations as you would at first reading suppose, and I venture to assert it never can be unless by force of arms. In other words, this Constitution can't be stopped. It can't be amended. It's going to continue unless force of arms comes to bear. Federalist 15, the great and radical vice in the construction of this existing confederation is its principle of the legislation for states or governments in their corporate or collective capacities, and as contradistinguished from the individuals of which they consist. So, this is so basically what's happening here is in Federalist 15, you see a separation made between individuals in states, which is basically the government we had post-Civil War. It's just the center and individuals more so. And before that, under the Articles of Confederation, and I would say under the Constitution too, really, but this was what the Constitution and it was supposed to supposedly solve in the minds of some Federalists, that this was a legislation for states. So states were the parties to it, not individuals. In fact, I should say we the people, right? That line that Patrick Henry didn't like, that was the Committee on Style. It was, and originally it was we the people of the several states were listed, but since they all hadn't ratified it, it was better, more stylistically pleasing to say we the people. And Patrick Henry thought that's going to be bad. That's going to be misused. That's going to be misunderstood. Patrick Henry said, the question turns, sir, on that poor little thing, the expression we the people, instead of the states of America. I need not take so much pains to show that the principles of this system are extremely pernicious, impolitic, and dangerous. Is this a monarchy like England, a compact between the prince and the people with checks on the former to secure the liberty of the latter? Here is a revolution as radical as that which separated us from Great Britain. And Patrick Henry is saying, look, if we lose the states and it's just the center and the people, then we have a monarchy, essentially. We have an imperial presidency. We have judicial supremacy. We have all the things that we're now dealing with more so today, and it's not going to be good. That's not what we want. What is an American? This is the last slide. What is the spirit of America? Patrick Henry said this at the Virginia Ratification Convention. The voice of tradition, I trust, will inform posterity of our struggles for freedom. If our descendants be worthy the name of Americans, they will preserve and hand down to their latest posterity the transactions of the present times. And though I confess my exclamations are not worthy the hearing, they will see that I have done my utmost to preserve their liberty. The dissolution of the Union is most abhorrent to my mind. The first thing I have at heart is American liberty. The second thing is American union. To Patrick Henry, this is the essence of the American spirit. To be an American is to have at heart liberty. And second to that is union. Liberty is the important thing. Well, the liberty he was talking about is not the licentiousness of today. The liberty that he's talking about is to carry out the responsibilities God's given you unmolested from a government, a tyrannical government. And I think what's clear after going through many of the clips that we've mentioned here, that I've read, these snippets from the Federalist and Anti-Federalist papers, is that the Anti-Federalists could see a lot of what would happen eventually in this country. And they made points that probably should have been heeded more. Now, what could have been done? I don't know. I'm not sure. There were proposals to change various things. Obviously, the Bill of Rights got included. To make it easier to amend the Constitution, of course, was one of the things the Anti-Federalists wanted. To ensure that the courts wouldn't be as strong as they ended up becoming. And there's a little bit, I should mention this, there's a little bit of a debate as to whether or not the Federalists and the Anti-Federalists, in their arguments with each other, which were an argument for public support, right? This was happening in the open. This was in newspapers and so forth, whether they were representing the actual Constitution or the Constitution that they wanted to sell to the people, right? So the Federalists are trying to sell this, and the Anti-Federalists are trying to rip it down. And so one of the mistakes that's often made is people will go back and they'll read what the Federalists, for example, what Alexander Hamilton said, and they don't take into account the fact that he's trying to sell this also to the people. It should be taken into account. You should interpret the Constitution by some of these things. That should be at least factored in. But you have to realize this is a salesmanship game also that's going on. And so they're going to portray it as innocuous as possible, as not a threat at all. And the Anti-Federalists are going to portray it as more of a threat. Like, we don't know what we're getting into. And some of the things were overblown, but some of the things they got right. And so it's interesting to go back and look at these particular debates and wonder to yourself, who were the conservatives in this case? Who were the ones who wanted to conserve ordered liberty, traditional religion, the local and regional distinctions that people have, and those are particular arrangements, the Anglo-Protestant heritage that has been passed down? Who were the ones that were the most trying to preserve those kinds of things and learn the lessons from history that they had been given? And I'll let you decide. It's up to you whether you think it's the Federalists or the Anti-Federalists. I think I lean more towards the Anti-Federalists, though. I think that they had a lot of prescient things to say, and I think they were more conservative on this than the Federalists were. Not that the Federalists all weren't conservatives, but they ended up, many who went along with them too, ended up buying what they sold and buying how the Constitution was interpreted initially. And what's happened over time is the Anti-Federalist predictions about how it would be interpreted and these weak points, how they would be exploited, those things have happened, and we're downstream from that. So is the fault the Constitution? Maybe not. Maybe not in every case. Maybe it's human nature that's the fault. And human nature finds an available pathway to exercise its control and power, no matter what. But you don't want to make it easy for human nature to do that. And there were some points in the Constitution, like the Elastic Clause, like the General Welfare Clause, like the Supremacy Clause, that made it a little easier. And the Anti-Federalists were able to point those things out. And so for that reason, I believe that these particular men, the Anti-Federalists, should be thought of as heroes of the Republic. They warned the Republic of what would happen, what were some of the weak points. And here's a picture of them once again, with the chief of them being my favorite, Patrick Henry. Well, I hope that is helpful to you in understanding not just the Anti-Federalists, but also the Federalists. And it will prepare us for what we're going to do next in examining the disquisition of government by John C. Calhoun, which will most likely be the next one. Either that, or we might do this. I have it on my desk. New Views of the Constitution of the United States by John Taylor of Caroline. So we might talk about John Taylor of Caroline and his view of the Constitution versus Joseph Story's. Joseph Story is often quoted today. He's, I wouldn't say the conservative, though. It's John Taylor who's the conservative. So we might talk about that. But if we don't, we're going to jump into the disquisition. Either way, we're getting to the disquisition, whether it's the next one or the one after that. So if you want to read the disquisition of government by John C. Calhoun, or read both of them. Read New Views of the Constitution of the United States by John Taylor of Caroline. That's it for our second installment of the Anglo-American Conservative Book Series. God bless.